The whine of the band saw in the workshop with power tools and guards was a familiar, comforting hum, a steady counterpoint to the soft rasp of sandpaper against aged mahogany. Dust motes, tiny galaxies of light, spun and shimmered in the afternoon sunbeams that speared through the tall, grimy windows. My hands, calloused but precise, moved with an almost surgical delicacy over the intricate carving of a Georgian writing desk, coaxing out the original luster hidden beneath generations of grime and neglect. This was my world, a universe of forgotten beauty and quiet resurrection. Every grain, every join, every faint scratch held a story, and it was my singular purpose to understand and preserve it. The faint, rhythmic thud of a guard's boots patrolling the perimeter outside my specialized section of the warehouse was usually a distant, almost subconscious assurance. Today, though, it felt different. A little too crisp, a little too close, an unwelcome intrusion into my sanctuary of sawdust and solvents. My focus, usually absolute, kept snagging on the memory of the solicitor's clipped voice, the unexpected inheritance. A manor house, he'd said. Isolated. Ancient and mine. I hadn't known of its existence until a few weeks ago, a distant relative I'd never met, a name I barely recognized from a faded family tree I'd once idly traced. The news had arrived like a misplaced parcel, unexpected and slightly bewildering. Me, a solitary restorer whose closest companions were chisels and sandpaper, inheriting a sprawling estate. It felt like a plot device from a novel I'd never read. With a final, satisfying buff, I stepped back, admiring the warm gleam of the mahogany. Perfection, as close as I could get it. I carefully placed the tools back in their designated slots on the pegboard, each hammer, each chisel, each brush aligned with obsessive order. My work here was done, for now. The prospect of leaving this organized chaos for the unknown chaos of the manor house was both thrilling and deeply unsettling. The drive was long, stretching into the late afternoon. The road, initially paved and familiar, gradually deteriorated, shedding its asphalt skin for cracked gravel, then finally a narrow, overgrown track barely wide enough for my vehicle. Trees, ancient and gnarled, formed a dense canopy overhead, swallowing the light, turning the waning afternoon into a premature twilight. The air grew heavy, damp, carrying the scent of wet earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something metallic and cold, like distant rain on stone. Then, through a break in the trees, it appeared. It wasn't a house, it was a monolith. A hulking, skeletal silhouette against the bruised purple of the horizon. Gray stone, streaked with black lichen and green moss, rose 3 stories high, topped by a jagged roofline that looked like broken teeth. Windows, countless and empty, stared out like vacant eyes. Some were shattered, gaping holes, others merely opaque with generations of grime, reflecting nothing but the oppressive sky. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming, dwarfing the surrounding trees, making my modest vehicle feel like a child's toy. Neglect had clearly been its sole companion for decades, perhaps longer. I killed the engine. The sudden silence was profound, thick, an almost physical presence that pressed in on my ears. Stepping out, I felt the crunch of dead leaves and damp soil under my boots. The manor seemed to breathe, a slow, deliberate exhalation of dust and decay. Its presence was immense, a heavy cloak draped over the entire landscape. My meticulous nature, my desire for order, felt suddenly flimsy against this raw, untamed force of antiquity. I walked toward the main entrance, a massive oak door studded with rusted iron, half hidden by overgrown ivy. The stone path leading up to it was cracked and uneven, forcing me to watch my footing. As I drew closer, I could make out intricate carvings in the stone archway above the door, faded, weather-beaten grotesques, their faces eroded into vague, unsettling blurs. They seemed to watch me, silent and judging. I pushed the door inward. It moved with a tortured shriek, tearing itself from the embrace of the ivy. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing unnaturally on the unseen floor. As my eyes adjusted, my gaze swept across the vast entrance hall. Cobwebs hung like tattered shrouds from the impossibly high ceiling, draped over what might have once been grand chandeliers. Furniture, shrouded in white dust sheets, loomed like ghostly figures. But it wasn't the dust or the decay that snagged my attention, not immediately. It was the wall directly opposite the main door. It was entirely unadorned, a vast expanse of rough-hewn stone, utterly plain compared to the intricate carvings and cornices that adorned the rest of the hall. Yet, as I stared, something about it felt wrong. The stones, though uniform in size, seemed to shift in the dim light, almost imperceptibly. And then I saw it. This place was not merely old, it felt hungry. I was deep in it, lost in the delicate curve of an antique cabinet door, sanding away layers of grime and old varnish. My hands, calloused and precise, worked with an almost unconscious rhythm, seeking out the smooth, unblemished surface beneath. I needed the small, curved chisel for the intricate carving on the top rail. I'd used it moments ago, I was certain, leaving it right beside the pot of hide glue, nestled between a stack of oak offcuts. My memory was usually impeccable when it came to tool placement. It was a habit born of necessity, of knowing exactly where everything was in a space that could otherwise become a chaotic mess. But when I reached for it, my fingers met only the rough wood of the bench. A frown creased my brow. I scanned the immediate area. Nothing. I looked under the workbench, then in the tool rack above. The chisel wasn't there. I sighed, a small puff of dust escaping my lips. Getting forgetful, Reed, I muttered to myself, a wry smile playing on my lips. It had to be somewhere obvious, probably kicked into a corner by my boot or buried under a pile of wood shavings. I'd find it later. For now, a different, slightly larger chisel would have to do. It was a minor inconvenience, easily dismissed. The cabinet I was working on was an imposing piece, destined for the drawing room. Its dark, almost obsidian wood was riddled with centuries of neglect, but I could already see the potential, the elegant lines begging to be rediscovered. I imagined it gleaming, reflecting the subdued light of the grand room, a silent sentinel amidst polished surfaces and hushed conversations. My current task was just the beginning of a much larger undertaking, bringing this entire manor back to life. Later that afternoon, after a brief, solitary lunch of tin soup and stale bread, I decided to take a break from the workshop and assess the drawing room itself. It was a vast space, stretching across the front of the house, with 3 towering windows overlooking the overgrown gardens. Dust sheets draped over what remained of the furniture like ghostly shrouds, and the air hung heavy with the scent of decay and damp plaster. As I walked across the creaking floorboards, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the silence, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tap. 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 It seemed to emanate from somewhere upstairs, perhaps the landing directly above. I paused, tilting my head, listening intently. The sound was soft, almost delicate, like a small branch brushing against glass, or a pebble rolling on a wooden surface. My first thought was a bird trapped in an attic vent, or maybe a loose shutter rattling in a phantom breeze. But there was no breeze, not inside, and the tapping held a peculiar, deliberate cadence. Tap. Tap. I waited. Hello? I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the cavernous space. No answer. Of course not. I was alone here. I had been for days. I tried to rationalize it, but a prickle of unease started to crawl up my spine. Old houses made strange noises. Settling timbers, expanding and contracting with the temperature, drafts whistling through unseen cracks. It was all perfectly logical. Still, the sound had been distinct. Each step groaned beneath my weight. The upper landing was a wide expanse, lined with more closed doors. I listened again, holding my breath. Nothing but the faint thrum of my own pulse in my ears. All were firmly shut. I even tried a few handles, finding them stiff and locked. Returning to the drawing room, I stood in the middle of the space, feeling small and exposed. I picked up a dust sheet, intending to remove it from a particularly ornate side table, when I caught it. A flicker. At the very edge of my vision, near one of the tall windows, a brief, indistinct movement. It was gone before I could properly register it. I spun around, my heart giving a sudden, sharp thump against my ribs. The room was empty, save for the shrouded furniture and my own solitary figure. The sun, lower now, cast long, distorted patterns through the dirty panes, making the dust motes dance in frantic spirals. It must have been a trick of the light, I told myself, a momentary distortion caused by the motes, or perhaps my own tired eyes. My meticulous nature demanded a logical explanation for everything, especially when it came to my perceptions. I stood there for a long moment, unmoving, my muscles tensed. The silence stretched, growing taut, humming with an unspoken presence. There was nothing. No half-open door, no curtain swing in a non-existent draft. Just the vast, empty room, and me. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. Had a squatter somehow found their way in? Unlikely, given the heavy locks and the remote location. An animal? Perhaps, but the tapping had sounded too regular, too intentional. I shook my head, trying to clear the creeping unease. It was just the isolation getting to me, playing tricks. Old houses had a way of doing that, of making you feel less alone than you actually were. The house, I realized, was not entirely silent after all. It was waiting. I was elbow-deep in the restoration of a hulking, dark-wood secretary desk, a piece so ancient its joints groaned a silent protest with every movement. It had been tucked away in the manor's cobwebbed study, a forgotten sentinel gathering the dust of decades. My fingers, calloused and precise, traced the ornate carvings along one of the desk's many drawers. The wood felt strangely cold, even in the warmth of the workshop. As I ran my thumb over a particularly deep gouge, a subtle irregularity caught my attention. Not a flaw in the carving, but something else. A hairline seam, almost invisible beneath layers of grime and old wax, ran along the back panel of the drawer cavity. My breath hitched. Another secret, then. This old house, it just kept giving. With a dental pick and a small, stiff brush, I meticulously worked at the seam, clearing away the accumulated debris. The wood grain was expertly matched, a testament to the original craftsman's skill. A faint click, almost imperceptible over the rhythmic hum of the ventilation system, announced my success. Inside, nestled in the shallow recess, lay a small, leather-bound journal. There was no title, no name, just the faint impression of a crest I couldn't quite decipher. My heart gave a little skip. This wasn't just another hidden compartment, this felt different. More intimate. I carefully extracted the journal. It felt surprisingly light, as if much of its substance had leached away over time. I settled onto my workbench stool, the tools around me suddenly silent observers. Opening the book was a delicate operation. The pages, thin and yellowed, crackled like dry leaves under my touch. The ink, a faded sepia, was elegant but wavering in places. The first few entries were mundane, detailing weather, household expenses, and local gossip. A previous owner, perhaps. The entries were dated from the late 1800s. Then, the tone shifted. The fog thickens around the mind. I find myself pausing, mid-sentence, the thought evaporating like morning mist. I frowned. Reading closer. My own reflection feels distant, as if I am observing a stranger. What was I doing just now? Where did I put the ledger? The simple things elude me. A prickle of unease started to crawl up my neck. This wasn't just absent-mindedness. The entries grew more erratic, the handwriting becoming less legible, sloping wildly across the lines. They say the house has a memory. That it remembers those who dwell within. But what if it remembers for you? What if it takes your own recollections, like a thief in the night, replacing them with its own echoes? My fingers tightened around the brittle cover. The air in the workshop, usually so familiar, suddenly felt heavy, pressing. I glanced around at my tools, the stacks of raw timber, the half-finished projects. All the comforting chaos of my work. But for a fleeting moment, a disorienting flicker, I couldn't quite place myself. Why was I here? What was I doing with this old wood? The thought was gone as quickly as it came, leaving behind a faint, unsettling echo. Stress, I told myself, rubbing my temples. Too many late nights, too much caffeine. This house, with its endless demands, was starting to get to me. I forced my attention back to the journal. The later entries were almost incoherent, a jumble of desperate phrases. Lost. What was my name? The faces. They blur. My own face. A stranger's. The house. It breathes. It feeds. The final page was covered in frantic, repetitive scratches. Not words, exactly, but a pattern of looping lines that seemed to coil in on themselves, a desperate, meaningless scrawl. It looked like someone had tried to write, but their hand had simply given up, their mind already elsewhere. The metallic tang in the air seemed stronger now, or perhaps it was just my imagination, a trick of the mind. I closed the journal, the dry leather rasping softly. The weight of it, or rather, the lack thereof, felt significant. It was empty, not just of physical mass, but of the very essence of its previous owner. The words described a slow, insidious erosion, a quiet theft of self. Or if I had eaten breakfast at all. My stomach churned. It was just a lapse, a momentary blank. Nothing to worry about. Just fatigue. Just the old house playing tricks on my tired mind. The frantic, meaningless scrawl on that last page of the journal had burrowed under my skin. The implication hung heavy. Whatever had happened to the previous occupant, it hadn't been quick or clean. I knew then that simply restoring the manor wouldn't be enough. I needed to understand its history, to find out what had twisted that poor soul's thoughts into such desperate loops. My research began in earnest, a desperate attempt to anchor myself in facts before the house pulled me completely into its currents. I spent days sifting through local archives, dusty newspaper clippings, and forgotten property records. The librarian, a quiet woman with spectacles perched on her nose, seemed to eye me with a mixture of curiosity and concern as I requested increasingly obscure documents related to the old manor. The early records were sparse, mostly property transfers and mentions of various owners. But as I delved into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a pattern began to emerge, faint but chilling. There were vague reports of unexplained disappearances among staff, always attributed to them simply moving on, yet with no forwarding addresses or trace. One short article, yellowed and brittle, mentioned a local official who had retired to the manor, only to be found months later wandering the surrounding woods, babbling incoherently about shifting walls and stolen thoughts. He was described as having suffered a complete mental collapse and was never seen in public again. Another, even briefer, spoke of an entire family abandoning the property overnight, leaving everything behind, their reasons a mystery. Each account was fragmented, almost deliberately vague, as if a collective effort had been made to forget the manor's true narrative. It was like trying to piece together a mosaic from shards where half the pieces were missing, and the other half had been deliberately defaced. The more I read, the more the lines between my research and my own experience began to blur. The sleep I did manage to snatch was no longer restorative. Nightmares became vivid, almost tangible. I dream of walking familiar corridors in the manor, only for the walls to ripple like water, the doors to vanish, and the very air to thicken with an unseen presence. Sometimes, I'd wake up convinced I'd heard my own name whispered from the corner of the room, a sound so faint it could have been the wind, or something far more insidious. Then came the waking moments of disorientation. I'd be in the middle of cleaning a particularly stubborn patch of grime from a banister, my mind focused, only to suddenly stand there, the rag in my hand, with no memory of what I was doing, or even why I was holding the rag. A blank space. Had I been standing there for minutes? Hours? I couldn't be sure. One afternoon, I needed a specialized router bit for a particularly intricate piece of carving I'd unearthed from the manor's library. It was a delicate job, requiring precision tools I didn't have on site. I drove to a fabrication outfit I sometimes used, a large, echoing workshop with power tools and guards at the entrance. The air inside hummed with the whine of saws and the metallic tang of fresh-cut wood. I greeted the attendant, a broad-shouldered man who knew me by sight, and headed towards the specialized tooling section. I picked out the bit, turning it over in my hand, admiring its fine edge. My gaze snagged on something. On the polished steel surface of one press, etched faintly, almost like an accidental scratch, was a symbol. 3 interlocking loops, forming a tight, endless knot. It was the same pattern I'd seen in the frantic scrawl on the last page of the journal, the one I'd been trying to decipher. How could it be here? Was it a common industrial mark? Or was it? I reached out, my finger tracing the cold metal. The loops felt impossibly familiar. He was standing beside me, a quizzical look on his face. I pulled my hand back, my gaze snapping to the press. The symbol wasn't there. The steel was smooth, unblemished, reflecting the overhead lights without a single scratch. My mind reeled. Had I imagined it? The attendant was still looking at me, waiting. No, I stammered, shaking my head. Just admiring the machinery. He nodded slowly, a faint frown creasing his brow. Right. Well, let me get that for you. I paid for the bit, my hands trembling slightly as I clutched the small bag. The drive back to the manor was a blur. The symbol. I was so sure I had seen it. But it was gone. Just like my memories of what I'd done moments before, just like the forgotten names in the archives. The house wasn't just trying to hide its history, it was trying to erase mine. I started to wonder if I was truly researching the manor's past, or if I was simply watching my own present dissolve, one terrifying fragment at a time. The determined resolve I'd clung to felt brittle, threatening to shatter. The small bag containing the specialized bit felt heavy in my hand, a leaden weight against my clammy palm. The drive back to the manor was less a journey and more a series of disconnected flashes, the rain-streaked windshield, the looming silhouette of the house against a bruised sky, the crunch of gravel under the tires. The symbol. Just like my memories of what I'd done moments before, just like the forgotten names in the dusty archives. The house wasn't just old. It was hungry. I forced myself into a semblance of routine. The only way to fight this creeping dread, I reasoned, was to work. To ground myself in the tangible, the methodical rhythm of restoration. I headed straight for the workshop with power tools and guards, the hum of the ventilation system a familiar drone against the incessant patter of rain outside. 2 burly guards stood by the heavy door, their faces impassive as I entered. Their presence should have been a comfort, a bulwark against the unsettling whispers of the manor, but lately, even their stolid silence felt charged. I pulled on my smock, the stiff canvas a reassuring weight on my shoulders. On my workbench lay a tarnished silver mirror frame, a particularly intricate piece I'd been meaning to tackle. It was from the master suite, or so I vaguely recalled. Lately, even the provenance of the pieces I handled felt slippery, like wet soap in my grip. The whirring sound, usually a steady companion, seemed to stutter, a faint, almost imperceptible hiccup in its rhythm. I ignored it, focusing on the delicate filigree of the frame. My hands, usually so steady, trembled. Not violently, but a persistent tremor that made the intricate work frustratingly difficult. "Everything all right, Reed?" one of the guards asked, his voice a low rumble from the doorway. He hadn't moved. Just watched. "Fine," I grunted, not looking up. "Just concentrating." I applied the tool to the silver, the fine abrasive kicking up a faint cloud of metallic dust. As I worked, a peculiar scent began to waft through the workshop. It wasn't the usual tang of oil, metal, and wood shavings. It was the smell of the manor itself, but concentrated, intensified, as if the house was exhaling directly into the room. The air grew heavy, almost viscous. The hum of the ventilation system seemed to deepen, becoming a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the floor. I glanced up. The guards were still there, still impassive. Did they not smell it? Did they not hear it? I looked back at the mirror frame. As I polished a particularly ornate curve, the silver seemed to ripple, not with the natural sheen of polished metal, but like disturbed water. The reflection in the small, still tarnished mirror within the frame caught my eye. It wasn't my reflection. Not quite. A face stared back. The eyes, though, were wrong. It was a face that knew me, knew my fears, and it smiled slowly, a silent, predatory unfolding of lips. I dropped the rotary tool. It clattered to the concrete floor, spinning for a moment before dying with a final, pathetic click. The guards looked at me. "What was what, Reed?" the second one asked, his brow furrowing slightly. The face. In the mirror. I stammered, pointing a trembling finger at the silver frame. "Didn't you see it?" They exchanged a quick, unreadable glance. "See what?" the first guard asked, his tone flat. "You dropped your tool. You all right?" My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the rising tide of panic. They hadn't seen it. Or they were pretending not to. Was it all in my head? Had the lack of sleep, the mounting pressure, finally broken something inside me? I reached for the mirror frame, my fingers brushing against the cool, smooth silver. I could still feel the phantom presence of those eyes, that smile. What was its significance? The thought felt like trying to grasp smoke. It was important, I knew that much, but the why eluded me. "You forget." I spun around, my eyes darting across the workshop. The guards were still there, watching me. The power tools stood silent, dormant. The air still carried that sickly sweet, earthy scent. The growling hum of the ventilation had subsided to its normal drone. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "No one, Reed," the second guard said, a hint of concern in his voice now. "Just you and us." But I knew there was something else. I looked at the mirror again. My reflection stared back, wide-eyed and terrified. What was my name? Reed. Yes. What was I doing here? Restoring the manor. Why? I inherited it. From whom? A blank. A vast, echoing chasm where a memory should have been. I knew I had inherited it, but the details, the person, the circumstances, they were gone, wiped clean. It wasn't just the manor's secrets that were eroding. It was me. I grabbed the mirror frame, needing something solid, something real. But as my fingers closed around the silver, a jolt, not of electricity but of pure, icy despair, shot through me. And in its surface, for a fleeting, horrifying instant, I saw not my reflection, but a swirling vortex of indistinct faces, all screaming, all utterly devoid of memory. Then it was gone, leaving only my own distorted, panicked visage staring back. It was in my mind, a phantom limb reaching into the very core of my identity, slowly, meticulously, tearing me apart from the inside out. I felt a piece of myself detach, a fundamental sliver of who I was, simply float away. The lines between what I saw, what I heard, and what was manufactured by this unseen predator had not just blurred, they had dissolved entirely. The mirror's cold truth still clung to me, a shiver in my bones. Reed. Yes. My name. But the way it had almost vanished, the sudden void where my purpose should have been. No, I couldn't let that happen again. Not now. Not ever. I had to get out. My hand instinctively went to my pocket, fumbling for my phone. The smooth, cold glass was a small comfort, a tangible link to the world I was rapidly losing. I thumbed it on, the screen flaring to life, the familiar icons a brief, reassuring sight. No signal. Of course. There was rarely good reception out here, tucked away in this valley, but I'd always managed to get a bar or two near the front door. The little antenna icon was a ghost, utterly blank. I tried calling a colleague, then a general emergency number, then even the number of the solicitor who'd handled the inheritance. Each attempt met with the same flat, dead air, a mechanical voice informing me the call could not be completed. My fingers trembled as I slipped the useless device back into my pocket. Communication was a bust. I had to try a physical escape. I stalked through the drawing room, the dust motes dancing in the slivers of weak sunlight that pierced the grimy windows. The front door. It was heavy, made of thick oak, studded with iron. It didn't budge. I leaned into it, pushing, then pulling, grunting with effort. Nothing. It felt as if the house itself had sealed the frame, the wood swollen and fused. I tried the deadbolt, the chain, the lower latch. All were firmly, irrevocably set. It wasn't just locked, it felt welded. My gaze swept around the room, settling on the tall, narrow windows. They were caked with years of grime, the glass thick and wavy. It was painted shut, then nailed, then perhaps even bricked up from the outside. The frame didn't give an inch. I moved from window to window, my frustration mounting with each failed attempt. My breath hitched in my throat. This wasn't just old age or disrepair. This was deliberate. The manor wasn't just isolated, it was a cage. A thought, a flicker of an old memory, pierced through the fog. The previous owner, a reclusive industrialist, had supposedly maintained a private workshop on the lower levels, a secure space for his more peculiar hobbies. If there was any way out, any service entrance or tunnel, it would be down there. It was a long shot, but what else did I have? The smell of damp earth and something metallic, like old iron filings, became more pronounced. I followed the winding servants' passages I'd only vaguely explored, past the cavernous, empty kitchens and pantries, until I reached a heavy, steel-plated door. It was bolted, but not locked. My hands, slick with a nervous sweat, fumbled with the thick iron bar, sliding it free with a resonant clang that echoed down the stone corridor. Beyond lay a narrow, concrete stairwell, leading down into a deeper gloom. I descended cautiously, each step sending reverberations through the cold stone. At the bottom, a long, low-ceilinged corridor stretched out, illuminated by bare, caged bulbs hanging from the ceiling, casting harsh, uneven light. This was it. This was the workshop with power tools and guards. The corridor opened into a vast, industrial space. A low, persistent hum vibrated through the floor, a symphony of unseen machinery. And then I saw them. Two figures. They stood perfectly still, positioned near a heavy blast door at the far end of the workshop. They weren't moving. They weren't speaking. They simply were. Their posture was unnaturally rigid, almost formal, like statues carved from granite. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the low thrum of the machinery. Guards. Here? In a derelict manner, for what purpose? Had the solicitor sent them? Was this some security measure for the inheritance? But they hadn't been here before, or had they? Had I simply forgotten them? No. I would have remembered two silent, unmoving figures in a forgotten workshop. I took a tentative step forward, then another. The guards remained unmoving, their gazes, or where I imagined their gazes to be, fixed ahead. Their stillness was the most terrifying thing. No shift of weight, no casual glance, no twitch of a muscle. They were like sentinels, carved into existence. Hello? My voice was a thin, reedy sound in the cavernous space. It seemed to vanish, swallowed by the hum. No response. Not even a flicker. I took another step, then another, trying to appear confident, though my knees felt like water. I needed to get past them, to see what lay beyond that blast door. Was it another way out? A road? A tunnel? As I drew closer, perhaps 20 feet away, one of the guards finally moved. It was a slow, deliberate turn of the head, like a rusty gear grinding into motion. Their companion remained perfectly still. I need to leave, I said, my voice gaining a desperate edge. I need to get out of here. The moving guard lifted a hand. Slowly. Deliberately. It wasn't a threatening gesture, not an aggressive one. It was simply a barrier. A silent, unwavering command to stop. Their arm extended, palm facing me, and it stayed there, unwavering, like a signpost. I looked back at the first. There was no emotion in their posture, no hint of menace, just an absolute, unyielding presence. It was worse than an overt threat. It implied an authority, a certainty that I could not breach, that I did not understand. My gaze darted to the workbenches. A heavy wrench, a pry bar. Could I fight my way out? The thought was fleeting, immediately dismissed. These weren't men to be reasoned with, or even fought. They were something else. A dull ache began to throb behind my eyes. My focus wavered. Why was I here again? What was I trying to do? The blast door, the guards. It all felt suddenly distant, like a scene playing out behind a pane of thick glass. I blinked, shaking my head, trying to clear the encroaching fog. Escape. Get out. Read. The guard's outstretched hand remained, an unyielding wall. The manor wasn't just keeping me in, it was making me forget why I wanted to leave. I took a step back. Then another. The guard's hand did not lower. The hum of the machinery seemed to grow louder, filling the space, vibrating through my very bones. I turned, my shoulders slumped, and began the long, silent walk back up the concrete stairs, leaving the workshop with power tools and guards behind, its secrets and its silent sentinels intact. The manor had won this round. And I was losing myself with every passing minute. Making me for something. The thought, formless and cold, clung to the edges of my awareness, a predator in the fog. I didn't know what I was being made for, only that the process was insidious, unrelenting. A rough hand gripped my arm, pulling me forward. I stumbled, my feet heavy, disconnected from my will. When my vision sharpened, I found myself standing in the workshop with power tools and guards. The air here was thick with the scent of linseed oil, freshly cut oak, and something else, a faint, cloying sweetness like overripe fruit, mixed with the acrid bite of rust. Overhead, bare bulbs cast a harsh, unforgiving light on workbenches laden with chisels, saws, and gleaming drills. The heavy, dormant machinery stood like silent, hulking beasts, their power cables coiled neatly, waiting. 2 guards, their faces impassive, stood near the exit, their gazes fixed on me. Another, the one who'd gripped my arm, now stood beside a large, ornately carved chest I remembered starting to restore weeks ago. My breath hitched. The chest. I'd been drawn to its intricate, almost obsessive carvings, tendrils twisting, faces contorted in silent screams, all woven into a pattern that seemed to shift under direct scrutiny. I'd set it aside, sensing something wrong, something active within its ancient wood. Now, it was not only open, but a series of thin, brittle scrolls lay unfurled within its velvet-lined belly. They were not mine. The guard beside the chest made a low, guttural sound, not quite a word, but a command. He gestured towards the scrolls with a thick finger. My mind, a battlefield of fading memories and rising panic, struggled to grasp the situation. Why were these here? And why was I being forced to look at them? I moved closer, my legs feeling like lead. The scrolls were parchment, yellowed and cracked, covered in a script I didn't recognize. It was a language of angular lines and strange, looping symbols, etched in faded ink. It wasn't just text, there were crude, disturbing illustrations. Stick figures, some with exaggerated, vacant eyes, others with their heads replaced by swirling vortexes. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, pierced through the haze. The dream of waking up, knowing everything, yet remembering nothing. It felt dry, almost papery thin, as if it could crumble to dust at any moment. As my skin made contact, a surge of raw, untranslated understanding flooded my mind. Not words, but concepts. Images, feelings, a horrifying narrative downloaded directly into my consciousness. The entity. It wasn't merely ancient, it was primordial, a hunger born from the very earth beneath the manor. Not a creature of flesh and bone, but of pure, predatory absence. It had lain dormant for centuries, a seed of oblivion, until the manor's decay, the turning of the soil, the echoes of forgotten lives, had stirred it. Its nature was parasitic. It didn't just feed on life, but on the essence of life, memory, identity, the intricate tapestry of self. It latched onto a mind, not to consume it whole, but to slowly unravel it, thread by thread. It preferred the slow, agonizing process, the struggle, the despair, the frantic clinging to what was being lost. Each forgotten name, each blurred face, each lost skill, each erased personal history, these were its sustenance. The method was insidious. It didn't just take, it replaced. It thrived on the confusion, on the host's desperate attempts to discern real from imagined. The blank faces in the drawings, I now understood, were not merely victims, they were vessels, emptied and reshaped, their original identities utterly annihilated. The vortexes were the swirling drain of self. The scroll detailed the cycle, the terrible ritual. Once a mind was sufficiently stripped, a sacrifice was required. Not of blood, not of flesh, but of a complete, willing surrender. Only then could the entity fully inhabit the husk, gaining not just sustenance, but a new anchor in the physical world, a new pair of eyes to perceive, a new mind to manipulate. It didn't want a struggle at the end, it wanted acceptance. It wanted the host to choose its own erasure. And the ultimate cost? Not just death, but utter oblivion. And then, the cycle would begin anew with another victim, drawn into the manor's inescapable grasp. The sacrifice wasn't just my identity, it was the sacrifice of any hope of ever truly existing again. The guards, silent and unmoving, seemed to watch not me, but the horror unfolding within my mind. They were merely custodians, ensuring the process continued. This wasn't just a manor, it was a hungry maw, and I was being fattened for the final, horrifying meal. The truth, stark and brutal, had been laid bare. And now, I knew what it demanded. The rough hand was still there, a solid anchor in the swirling chaos of my awareness. It pulled, and I stumbled, my knees protesting, my feet foreign beneath me. The world tilted, a kaleidoscope of blurred edges and uncertain light. I was being moved, that much I knew, but where and why? The questions were like gnats, buzzing, impossible to swat away, each one dissolving into the next before I could grasp its meaning. Then, a sudden, jarring stop. The hand released me. I swayed, catching myself against something cold and metallic. The air here was different. Heavy. It tasted of ozone, hot oil, and the sharp, metallic tang of freshly cut steel. A low, persistent hum vibrated through the floor, a deep-seated thrum that burrowed into my bones. My eyes, though still struggling to focus, began to discern shapes. I was in a workshop with power tools and guards. The space was cavernous, dimly lit by bare bulbs hanging from a high ceiling, casting long, distorted shadows. Banks of workbenches stretched into the gloom, cluttered with wrenches, grinders, drills, and saws. A faint sheen of metallic dust coated everything, shimmering in the weak light. The air smelled of industry, of raw materials being shaped and reshaped. And then there were the guards. They watched me, or perhaps through me, their stillness unnerving. My own past was a patchwork quilt, half unstitched, revealing the rough stuffing beneath. The antique restorer. The man who cherished history, who found beauty in the forgotten and repaired the broken. But what was left of that man now? The entity had been diligent, meticulous, picking away at the threads of my identity, one by one. They were mine, I thought. The calluses, the faint scars from years of careful work. But the memories tied to those hands, the delicate brushstrokes, the intricate joinery, the careful polishing of aged wood, they were dissolving, like sugar in hot tea. A low whine started, then escalated to a piercing shriek as a grinding wheel spun up in the distance. The sound grated on my frayed nerves, but it also cut through the fog. It was a sound of creation, yes, but also of destruction. Of material being stripped away, refined, made anew. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just a workshop, it was a foundry, a forge for something far more insidious than metal. The entity wasn't just consuming my memories, it was processing them. It was taking the raw material of my life, my essence, and shaping it for its own unfathomable purpose. That's what the previous chapters making me for something had meant. I was being refined, distilled, transformed into a raw component. The thought solidified, bringing with it a horrifying reveal. The entity wasn't just a parasite, it was a collector, an artisan of identity. It wasn't simply devouring, it was repurposing. My memories, my unique perspective, my very sense of self, they were being meticulously stripped down, perhaps to be woven into a new, composite consciousness, or to fuel some grander, monstrous design. I wasn't just a meal, I was an ingredient. If it was making me, then I still had some agency. A sliver, perhaps, but enough. If my essence was being processed, then maybe, just maybe, I could contaminate the batch. Poison the well. My eyes scanned the workshop, the rows of tools, the heavy machinery. They were instruments of precise alteration, of cutting and shaping. My mind, though fractured, still retained the instinct of a restorer, of a craftsman. I understood tools, understood process. A desperate, high-stakes plan began to form, a terrifying mosaic of fragments. If the entity fed on memory and identity, if it sought to distill my essence, then I would give it something it couldn't digest. I would corrupt the very thing it sought to consume. I would make myself unusable. This would require an immense personal sacrifice. Not just my sanity, which was already tenuous, but my very essence. I would have to deliberately sever the last remaining threads of who I was, not allowing them to be taken, but destroying them myself. To make myself a blank slate, yes, but a scorched one. My gaze settled on a heavy-duty grinder, its wheel still spinning down from its earlier shriek, the air around it thick with the scent of pulverized metal. If I could use the tools here, the very instruments meant to process me, to instead dismantle my own identity in a way that rendered it toxic, unusable, then perhaps I could starve the entity. Or at least, make myself a bitter, fatal meal. The guards remained unmoving, silent sentinels. They didn't see the rebellion stirring behind my eyes, the terrible, tragic plan taking root in the barren landscape of my mind. It would be an act of ultimate self-erasure, a final, desperate defiance. To destroy myself, not for oblivion, but for a chance to deny the predator its feast. I would not be made into what it wanted. I would be unmade, by my own hand, into something unrecognizable, something undigestible. The question was a dull ache, a pebble caught in the gears of my mind, refusing to be dislodged. A new scent pricked at my nose, a metallic tang mixed with the dry, familiar dust of old wood and the faint, sweet decay of time. My eyes, though blurry, began to pick out shapes. Gloomy corners, draped in cobwebs like tattered shrouds. The glint of steel. The low hum of dormant machinery. The guards, two hulking shadows, flanked me, their grip like iron bands. They weren't speaking, just guiding, pushing, their presence a cold weight against my fading will. Then, the world solidified, albeit in a horrifying way. I was shoved forward, stumbling into the heart of the workshop with power tools and guards. It was exactly as I had seen it in the fleeting, terrible visions, a cavernous space, high ceilings lost in gloom, workbenches laden with wrenches, saws, drills, and grinders. The air hung thick with the ghosts of labor, the faint scent of oil and sawdust that had long since settled into the very fibers of the wood. This was it. The place I had been drawn to, the place I had feared, the stage for whatever final act awaited me. A flicker of clarity, sharp as a splinter, pierced through the fog. The plan. It was still there, a fragile blueprint etched into the deepest corner of my mind. The entity wanted me here. It wanted to finish me here, in a place of creation and destruction, a fitting end for a restorer. But I had a different idea. The guards released me, stepping back, their eyes unreadable in the dim light filtering through grimy windows. They were observers now, silent witnesses. The entity's presence swelled, a suffocating pressure that seemed to drain the color from the air, the sound from my ears. It began. Images flashed before me, not random, but targeted. My mother's face, laughing, then twisting into a sneer. My father, his hands calloused from years of work, now reaching for me with grasping, skeletal fingers. Your memories are ours, your past a fabrication. I staggered, pressing my hands against my temples. No. This wasn't real. I knew the truth. My mother's laugh was warm, not cruel. My father's hands were strong, guiding, not grasping. It felt foreign, a word without meaning. My name is Reed. The entity laughed, a soundless, mocking vibration that shook my bones. A name. A label. The tool. My plan. The entity's assault intensified, throwing a barrage of false memories at me, moments of shame, failure, betrayal, all twisting the truth, making me question every choice, every relationship. Was I truly the man I thought I was? Had I ever been? You are a fraud, the thought voice hissed. A pretender. This manor, your craft, it was never yours. You stole it. You stole your life. I stumbled towards the sander, my legs heavy, my mind a battlefield. Each step was an act of defiance, a desperate assertion of will. The guards watched, unmoving. They were part of the entity's stage, its audience. The tactile sensation, the solid reality of it, was a small anchor. I fumbled for the power switch, my hands shaking. Always will be. But as my thumb found the switch and pressed down, a different sound erupted. A high-pitched, insistent whine, the sound of the sander's motor kicking to life, its pad vibrating furiously. It was loud, abrasive, a physical disruption to the entity's psychic assault. I didn't aim the sander at an object. Instead, I held it aloft, letting the high-frequency vibration resonate through the workshop. The resonance. This wasn't just a place of memories, but a place where the manor's very structure, its wood, its stone, its forgotten objects, held a specific, low-frequency hum. The entity fed on that resonance, on the lingering echoes of lives lived and forgotten. My sander, with its opposing, high-frequency vibration, was disrupting its meal. This was the reveal. The entity wasn't just consuming my memories, but drawing power from the very fabric of the manor itself, a vast, decaying reservoir of forgotten identities and echoes. The workshop, filled with objects that had been touched, worked, imbued with human presence, was a particularly potent feeding ground. My plan wasn't to destroy the entity, but to deafen it, to create a cacophony that would disrupt its consumption. The entity shrieked, a soundless scream that threatened to tear my mind apart. It retaliated with a furious, concentrated blast. My name, Reed, evaporated from my awareness. My face, my history, my very sense of being a distinct individual, it all dissolved into a swirling vortex of nothingness. There was no Reed, only an awareness of profound, terrifying emptiness. My body convulsed, but the sander remained clutched in my hand, its whine a desperate, buzzing mantra. I couldn't think, couldn't remember, couldn't even be. But something primal, something deeper than memory, responded to the vibration. A stubborn refusal to cease existing. No. The thought wasn't mine, but I was the one thinking it. A raw, unformed defiance. I didn't know who I was, but I knew I was something. I was here. This body, this hand gripping the vibrating tool, it was mine. A single, pure, unadulterated truth. The high-pitched whine of the sander continued, a defiant shriek in the face of oblivion. I didn't know if it was enough, but in that moment, I was nothing but the vibration, the sound, the stubborn, desperate refusal to be unmade. And for now, it was enough to keep the Reed that was left, however fragmented, from being utterly consumed. The air in the workshop still hummed with menace, but the suffocating pressure had receded, leaving me gasping, battered, but undeniably, still here. The high-pitched whine of the sander continued, a shrill, insistent note that vibrated up my arm, through my shoulder, and settled like a tremor behind my eyes. I was here. This was my hand. The raw defiance from moments ago still hummed in my veins, a fragile, hard-won ember against the vast, cold emptiness where my past used to be. The tool felt right, familiar, a solid anchor in a world that had become liquid. Then, the whine cut out. The sudden silence was a physical blow, a vacuum that sucked the air from my lungs. My hand, still clenched around the now inert sander, felt heavy, useless. I looked up, blinking against the fluorescent glare of the overhead lights. The workshop, with its power tools and guards, stretched out before me, a stark, sterile contrast to the decaying manor I remembered. Or thought I remembered. A man in a dark uniform, one of the guards, stood over a control panel, his back to me. He hadn't said anything, just flipped a switch. The other guard, a broader figure, leaned against a workbench piled with dismembered furniture, watching me with an unnerving stillness. Their presence felt less like protection and more like containment. My gaze drifted across the room. Varnish fumes mingled with the sharp tang of freshly cut wood and the metallic scent of machine oil. The air was thick, cloying. My work. But the memory of starting that piece, of planning its restoration, was gone. A blank. A tremor started in my hands, not from the sander this time, but from within. I tried to recall my name. Reed. Yes. But why did it feel like a word I'd just learned? A label applied, not an inherent truth. I closed my eyes, willing a flood of images, of faces, of moments. Nothing. Assessment, the broad guard said, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. He pushed himself off the workbench, the creak of his leather belt the only sound in the cavernous space. Assessment. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. It wasn't a question, but a command. I wanted to ask, assessment of what? But the words wouldn't form. My tongue felt thick, clumsy. I remembered a house. A grand, crumbling place. I remembered fighting it, or something like it. An erosion. A theft. My memories. My identity. Had I won? As I walked towards the guard, each step felt unfamiliar, as if my legs were borrowed. The floor, concrete underfoot, was gritty with sawdust. My eyes narrowed, trying to focus, to make sense of it. It looked like dried mud? Something from that house. The broad guard led me to a small, enclosed room at the far end of the workshop, separated by a pane of reinforced glass. Inside, another individual, dressed in a plain gray suit, sat at a table, a tablet glowing faintly in front of them. The other guard remained in the workshop, watching through the glass, his presence a silent, constant pressure. I sat opposite the individual in gray. Their face was impassive, their gaze clinical. Reed, they began, their voice calm, measured. Do you remember the manor? The word, manor, hit me like a physical shock. It unlocked a fragmented image, a grand staircase, shrouded in dust sheets. The smell of damp earth and decay. It was a partial truth. I remembered it, the idea of it, the feeling of it. But the details, the vibrant tapestry of experience, were gone. Wiped clean. And the incident, the individual prompted, their eyes never leaving my face. Incident. That was a sterile word for a war, for a violation. I remembered the struggle, the desperate clinging to a truth, any truth, in the face of oblivion. I remembered the entity, or the impression of it, a hunger that devoured not flesh, but self. It took things, I managed, my voice strained. My memories. The individual made a note on their tablet. And now, I was Reed, I was an antique restorer, and I had fought something unspeakable. The entity might be gone, vanquished, or simply sated and dormant. But it had left its indelible mark, a landscape of craters where my past should have been. I had one, yes, but at what cost? The whirring of the belt sander was a dull thrum against the concrete floor, a familiar sound that should have been comforting. I stood in the workshop with power tools and guards, the smell of sawdust and cutting oil a sharp, metallic perfume in the air. My hands, once precise instruments of delicate restoration, felt clumsy, alien. The words were a mantra, a fragile anchor in a sea of shifting perceptions. The entity might be gone, vanquished, or simply sated. The thought tapered off, leaving a chill that had nothing to do with the cool draft from the overhead vents. 2 guards stood by the reinforced door, their gazes impassive, occasionally sweeping over me. They were silent sentinels, and I couldn't quite recall why they were there, for my protection? Or was it for theirs? The uncertainty was a low hum beneath the workshop's mechanical symphony. My fingers traced the grain, once a source of intimate connection, now merely a texture. The wood held no stories for me, no echoes of its past life in a forgotten forest or a carpenter's hands. It was just wood. This blankness, this absence of the usual whisper of an object's history, was a new kind of silence. I clamped the oak onto the workbench. The weight of the orbital sander felt good, solid in my grip. I pressed the trigger, and the machine roared to life, a vibrating force against my palm. Dust plumed, catching the harsh fluorescent light. I worked, trying to lose myself in the rhythm, in the simple, physical act of stripping away the rough surface. This was what I did. This was who I was. Reed, the restorer. But the rhythm felt off. My movements were automatic, yet disconnected. It was like watching someone else's hands go through the motions. A faint tremor ran through me, not from the sander, but from within. I blinked, and it was gone. Just the tired face of a man who had seen too much. A new project sat on the corner of my bench, a small, intricate music box, its lacquered surface dulled by time, its brass fittings tarnished. A note had been attached to it, in neat, unfamiliar handwriting: "Read for your assessment." A personal piece. A personal piece. The words felt like a challenge. It was old, certainly. Victorian, perhaps. Not a memory of the box itself, but a sensation. This was it. This was what I craved. The entity had fed on memory, on identity. And I felt a strange, nascent hunger in its wake. I opened the lid. A tiny ballerina, frozen mid-pirouette, stood within. I wound the key. A hesitant, tinny melody began to play, a waltz, thin and reedy. As the music filled the workshop, something shifted inside me. The faint sensations grew clearer, sharper. I saw a child, a girl with ringlets and a faded velvet dress, twirling in a sunlit nursery. I felt her delight, her innocent joy. And then, a profound sadness, a sudden, sharp ache of abandonment as the music box was put away, forgotten. It wasn't my memory. It wasn't the box's memory, either, not in the way I used to perceive it. It was raw. Unfiltered. And as I held the music box, the sensations intensified, flowing into me, not as information to be processed, but as sustenance. A warmth spread through my chest, a quiet satisfaction. The music faded. The ballerina stilled. I looked down at the music box. Its lacquer seemed to gleam a little brighter, the brass a fraction more polished, as if some of its faded vitality had been siphoned off, absorbed. I felt stronger. Clearer. The world around me, the workshop, the guards, all snapped into sharper focus. The hunger, though, remained. A new, subtle craving. I looked at the oak panel I'd been sanding. It was still blank, waiting. But now, I saw its potential in a different light. What if I could imbue it? Not just restore, but infuse asterisk? My gaze drifted to the guards. They stood, solid and oblivious, their minds a rich tapestry of experiences, of lives lived, of hopes and fears. I could feel the hum of their identities, faint yet distinct, like distant stars. I walked over to the steel cabinet again, catching my reflection. The shimmer in my eyes was more pronounced now, a subtle, undulating flicker, like oil on water. And behind it, deep within the pupils, I saw it. A vast, ancient emptiness. A profound hunger. My own reflection stared back, no longer just tired. There was a knowingness there, a terrifying serenity. I was Reed. I was an antique restorer. But the victory hadn't been mine. It had been a transformation. The entity hadn't been vanquished. It had simply found a new, more perfect vessel. A collector. I remembered the manor, its decaying grandeur, its insatiable appetite. And I realized, with a sickening jolt, that the manor had merely been a fixed point, a single, hungry mouth. I was mobile. I was free. And the world was full of memories, full of identities, waiting to be assessed. I smiled, a slow, unfamiliar stretch of my lips. The guards shifted, their eyes meeting mine for a fleeting moment. They saw only Reed, the man. They didn't see the ancient hunger that now gleamed in his eyes. The melody of the music box, though silent, echoed in my mind. A lullaby. A promise. My stomach gave a strange, satisfied rumble. I picked up the oak panel again. It felt light, expectant. I could feel the faint, lingering memories of the trees it came from, the hands that cut it. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I could draw them out. I could consume them. The workshop with power tools and guards. A cage, perhaps, for the man they thought I was. But for the entity, for what I had become, it was merely the first step. A place to learn, to hone the new hunger. And soon, I would walk out of this place. And the world would never be the same.